You know, Turkey, it's a country that consistently pops up in our news feeds, doesn't it?
It really does.
Whether it's discussions around the complexities of its political landscape, the intricacies of its relationships with neighbors like Greece and Iraq.
Yeah, the border issues.
Right, or just trying to grasp the sheer scale and history woven into its major cities.
Mhm.
It really makes you wonder about the deeper currents,
Mhm.
the historical forces that have shaped modern Turkey and led to the multifaceted picture we see today.
Absolutely, and that's precisely what we're setting out to explore in this deep dive.
Okay.
We have compelling document, a brief history of Turkey, and our mission is to extract the essential historical themes that provide context for its present-day realities.
Sort of getting underneath the headlines.
Exactly. Think of it as gaining a well-informed perspective, maybe a shortcut to understanding the foundational elements of this fascinating nation.
Okay, so we're diving deep into this history. What are the key areas we'll be focusing on to make sense of it all? What's our framework for this exploration?
Well, our source identifies 5 crucial themes.
5 themes, okay.
First, we'll trace the journey of the Turks to this land. Second, we'll examine the formation of the state following the establishment of the republic.
Right, the state itself.
Third, we'll look at the significant economic developments and the, well, inevitable periods of upheaval.
Ups and downs.
Fourth, we'll explore the social and cultural transformations from the vast Ottoman Empire to the modern republic. And finally, we'll analyze Turkey's evolving foreign relations and its place in the global landscape.
Sounds like a solid plan. So let's go right back to the beginning. The arrival of the Turks. Where did they originate, and what brought them to the region we now know as Turkey?
Right. Their story begins in the heart of Central Asia with Karluk tribes in what is now Mongolia.
Mongolia, okay.
These were nomadic peoples who gradually transitioned to a more settled existence on the Central Asian plateaus. Then, in the 11th century, we see the rise of the Seljuk Turks,
The Seljuks.
a powerful force that consolidated its power and expanded militarily from the upper Oxus River across the Iranian plateau, and even capturing Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate at the time.
Okay, so the Seljuks are on the move and making a significant impact. How does this movement connect them to Anatolia, the core of modern Turkey?
Well, even as the Seljuk Empire was forming, various other Turkish tribes were also migrating westward.
Ah, so not just the Seljuks.
No, others too. Entering Anatolia starting in the late 10th century, this was happening while the Byzantine Empire, which then controlled Anatolia, was facing considerable internal political instability.
Right, ripe for change, maybe?
You could say that. Then comes a pivotal moment. In the late 11th century, the Seljuk leader, Sultan Alparslan, decisively defeated the Byzantine army.
A major battle.
Huge. This victory opened the door for the Seljuks to capture a large portion of Anatolia.
That sounds like a real turning point. What did the Seljuks do after gaining control of so much land? Did they simply rule it, or did they actively shape it?
Oh, they actively reshaped it. The Seljuks began constructing new cities, with Konya becoming a particularly important center.
Konya, right.
They also invested heavily in infrastructure, building mosques for worship, madrasas, think of them as religious colleges,
Okay.
hammams, which were public bathhouses crucial for social and hygiene purposes, and caravanserais, those roadside inns that supported the flow of trade.
So really building a society there?
Definitely.
Yeah.
However, this period of Seljuk dominance was relatively short-lived.
Oh, why was that?
Due to internal divisions and then the major disruption of the Mongol invasion.
Yeah, the Mongols, a force that seemed to destabilize much of Eurasia. So, with the decline of the Seljuks, what happens next in Anatolia? Is that when the Ottomans emerge?
Exactly. In the late 13th century, the Ottomans arrived, also with roots in Central Asia.
Okay.
At this time, Anatolia was once again politically fragmented, but interestingly, urban centers were prospering, and there was a rich and diverse cultural scene.
Fragmented but vibrant.
Yes. The Ottomans initially established themselves as a small beylik. Think of a beylik as a minor principality, like a city-state finding its footing after a larger empire breaks apart.
Got it.
Right on the frontier of the weakened Byzantine Empire in 1299. Their success in outmaneuvering other beyliks is really key to their subsequent rise.
So a small start with big potential. What were some of the crucial early steps in their expansion?
Well, one of their first major moves was the conquest of Bursa in 1326.
Bursa.
This became their new capital and the site of their first significant mosque. Then in 1364, they captured Adrianople, a major Byzantine city, and transformed it into a vital center and their second capital, firmly establishing their rule in Thrace, the European part of modern Turkey.
Into Europe already.
Right. From the 1380s onwards, the Ottomans began their expansion into the Balkans, seizing Sofia and pushing their reach towards Vienna. They also significantly increased their control over the Mediterranean.
Wow.
And of course, a truly monumental event was the fall of Constantinople itself in 1453.
Wow, from a minor principality to conquering one of the world's great cities. That's an incredibly rapid ascent. What followed that pivotal moment?
Their expansion continued. They acquired Egypt, gaining control of its highly lucrative trade routes.
Egypt, too. Huge economic gain.
Massive. While they built a vast empire stretching across Egypt, Greece, and much of Eastern Europe, their rule wasn't without challenge. Uprisings did occur against their authority.
Predictable, I suppose, with such a large empire.
After centuries of control and, yes, suppression, they ultimately lost the majority of their territories, primarily in the Balkans. This eventually leads us to the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in Anatolia in 1923.
And that marks a fundamental shift. We transition from this sprawling, multi-ethnic empire to a new republic focused on Anatolia. What were the initial priorities for this new republic under Mustafa Kemal, later known as Atatürk?
Well, Ataturk spearheaded an intense period of modernization, industrialization, and a turn towards the West in many aspects of society and governance.
A real push for change.
Definitely. However, despite these efforts and continued Western influence, the country experienced a resurgence of more radical Islamic thought in the 1980s, and persistent economic instability remained a significant challenge.
So that brings us to the end of the Ottoman era and the beginning of modern Turkey. But before we delve deeper into the Republic, I know our source emphasizes the ancient civilizations that existed in Anatolia long before the arrival of the Turks. This land wasn't a blank slate, was it?
Absolutely not. Anatolia has a very deep and rich history, stretching back thousands of years before the arrival of the Turkish peoples.
Right.
Our source points out that it's actually quite difficult to definitively identify the origins of these pre-Turkish Anatolians. We don't have a clear picture of a single, unified ancestral race or language that defined all the early inhabitants.
That's intriguing. So who were these people and what kind of legacy did they leave behind despite the lack of a single surviving language or defined race for many of them?
Well, despite this complexity, these pre-Turkish populations left a significant and lasting impact in various fields. We're talking about contributions to art, culture, legal systems, and intellectual and moral values.
So their influence remains, even if their specific identity is harder to pin down?
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder of the long history of civilization in this region. This contrasts with the later Turkish migrations, where the incoming groups largely maintained their language and cultural identity, which continues to this day.
Our source mentions some specific ancient civilizations of Anatolia. Who were some of the key groups that shaped this land before the Turks arrived?
Okay, well, going back to around 1000 BC, large Turkish empires did exist in Middle Asia, stretching from the East China Sea all the way to the Adriatic Sea.
Wow, huge empires even then.
Yes, these empires held sway over diverse racial groups settled in Anatolia. But focusing specifically on Anatolia itself, we see civilizations like the Hittites.
That's Hittites, yes.
They spoke an Indo-European language and were believed to be of the white race, known for their intelligence, humor, religious practices, and a strong sense of their own ethnicity.
Interesting. Who else?
Then we have the Phrygians, who are now actually believed by some to have Turkish origins.
Oh, really?
Yes, and are credited with spreading elements of their civilization to Rome and Macedonia. The Urartians, described as of the red race, were renowned for their exquisite weaving, textiles, and impressive architecture in the eastern part of Anatolia.
Amazing craftsmanship.
We also have mentions of the Kausas, described as of the black race, the Lydians, famously credited with inventing coinage,
Ah, the Lydians and money.
and numerous other groups like the Ionians, Aeolians, Carians, and Lycians, all contributing to a vibrant and diverse cultural tapestry.
Wow, a real crossroads of ancient cultures. When did the earliest of these civilizations begin to emerge in Anatolia?
The earliest known historical remnants date back to a period between 3000 and 1900 BC.
That far back.
Yeah. We find traces of civilization near Lake Van that may even go back to around 2500 BC. It's believed that a new civilization arose in that region during the latter half of the 4th millennium BC. This area later became part of the Hittite kingdom, with their capital Hattusa being founded around 1900 BC. The Hittites eventually conquered the kingdom of Urartu, incorporating earlier cultural elements into their own society.
So it sounds like Anatolia experienced multiple waves of migration and cultural influence long before the Turkish settlement we discussed earlier.
Precisely. Anatolia witnessed invasions and migrations from various groups. The Hittites themselves migrated south and west to establish Hatti. Later, around 1000 BC, the Phrygians succeeded Hatti, dominating central and eastern Anatolia for approximately 2 centuries.
2 centuries.
Following this, political unity fractured, and Anatolia fragmented into smaller states such as Lydia, Phrygia, and Urartu.
Let's delve a bit more into some of these later pre-Turkish powers, specifically the Lydians and Urartians. Our source gives them particular attention.
Right. The Lydians and Urartians rose to prominence in western and eastern Anatolia, respectively, during the first millennium BC, around the same time as the powerful Assyrian Empire.
Okay, contemporary with Assyria.
The Lydian civilization gradually evolved from a collection of tribes, likely with nomadic and pastoral origins, much like their eastern counterparts, the Urartians.
Similar origins, then.
Seems so. The transition to settled agriculture and permanent habitation probably began around the late 8th century BC. By the mid-7th century BC, they had established a significant kingdom in Asia Minor.
And the Urartians.
The Urartian kingdom, on the other hand, traced its descent from Proto-Hyasa tribes in eastern Anatolia. They also likely had initial mobility, engaging in pastoralism and trade, but their state organization steadily grew from the Van Basin, eventually controlling much of eastern Anatolia by the late 8th century BC, with Van becoming their political center under Assyrian influence.
And what about their belief systems? What kind of religious landscape existed in ancient Anatolia before the Greeks and Romans?
Well, based on the archaeological and textual evidence we have, religious beliefs in ancient Anatolia were largely polytheistic and animistic, with a strong local focus.
Local gods, shifting beliefs.
Right. The important deities weren't always fixed and could evolve over time. The oldest records we have are in Hittite and Luwian hieroglyphs. The Lydians seem to have had unique beliefs, possibly stemming from their tribal structure, which we piece together from legends recorded by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus.
Herodotus, okay. Then we have the arrival of the Greeks. When did they begin to colonize parts of Anatolia, and what was the state of the region when they arrived?
The Greeks started their colonization of the Aegean coast, the Propontis, that's the Sea of Marmara, and the western shores of Asia Minor around 750 BC.
To 750 BC.
When they arrived, many of the once proud cities like Troy, Miletus, Ephesus, and Smyrna were already in a state of ruin, remnants of earlier civilizations.
Ruins already. Wow.
Yeah. It's possible that the ancient Greek myths and legends, like those of Hercules and the Argonauts, and of course the Trojan War itself, played a role in motivating this westward expansion.
It sounds like the Greeks were moving into a land with a deep and often dramatic past, even in its dilapidated condition. What were some of their key settlements and interactions in Asia Minor?
Well, Miletus was one of the first cities they established in Asia Minor, and it initially flourished as a trading port.
Miletus, a big name?
Very. There was significant commercial rivalry between the 4 main Ionian cities, Miletus, Ephesus, Smyrna, and another unidentified one, and they even engaged in armed naval conflicts with the powerful kingdom of Lydia.
Fighting with the Lydians.
Yes. It's interesting to note that the Greeks, even after engaging in violent acts, had a tradition of recording these events in verse once they achieved dominance in a region.
Documenting their own history, even the messy parts.
Right. The fact that 7 Greek cities laid claim to be the birthplace of Homer suggests he was likely from western Anatolia during this period of Greek emigration.
Ah, Homer potentially being Anatolian Greek.
Exactly, highlighting that this region was both the cradle and, in a way, the final resting place of their early civilization in Asia Minor.
Fascinating to see how these different cultures overlapped and left their imprint on Anatolia. Now, moving forward in time, our source discusses the Roman and Byzantine periods. How did this region become integrated into the vast Roman Empire?
Okay, so in the 1st century AD, the region that constitutes modern-day Turkey became an integral part of the Roman Empire.
1st century AD.
This wasn't a peaceful incorporation. It followed a prolonged period of intense military campaigns and ultimately became the Roman province of Asia Minor. This area, known collectively as Anatolia, had already been home to Greek settlements for centuries, predominantly along the western and southern coastlines.
And what was life like in Anatolia under Roman rule? Did the established Greek culture simply vanish under Roman dominance?
Not entirely. The coastal cities underwent a transformation into Roman colonies, and their inhabitants were granted the significant privilege of Roman citizenship.
Roman citizenship, a big deal.
very much so. Similar rights and status were extended to high-ranking individuals in the inland provincial cities. While Rome consolidated its authority after some initial rebellions, the region experienced periods of unrest and even natural challenges like unusually heavy rainfall.
Governed by Rome, but still facing challenges.
Always. Initially, the province was administered by a single governor, but this later shifted to 3 governors. Despite this administrative structure, there were ongoing conflicts between the governors and the Roman Senate, resulting in a somewhat unstable peace.
Governor-Senate friction. Classic Rome.
You could say that. Interestingly, there's evidence of mutual support among the inhabitants of besieged cities, and people even utilized summer retreats in mountainous regions as safe havens for themselves and their livestock.
Practical adaptations.
And the Romans also constructed an extensive network of state roads connecting the provinces with Asia Minor, primarily to facilitate the efficient collection of taxes from merchants and traders.
Roads and taxes the Roman way. So we see the imposition of Roman infrastructure and administrative systems. Now, how does the Byzantine Empire fit into this historical progression?
Right. Byzantium, later renamed Constantinople by Emperor Constantine the Thrice, rose to become a city of immense importance within the Roman Empire. Constantine favored Byzantium, recognizing its strategic geographical location and the enduring strength of Hellenistic culture in the eastern half of the empire. The city flourished and eventually became the capital of the entire Roman Empire.
The new capital.
Yes. Even centuries later, after the arrival of the Turks, while Islam became the dominant faith, Constantinople's legacy as a major cultural and political center continued.
And what about the cultural and religious developments during the Byzantine era? How did they evolve from the earlier Roman and Greek influences?
Well, Christianity underwent a process of formalization, though our source suggests it may have, in some ways, lost some of its original spiritual intensity.
Formalization. Interesting term.
Under the reign of Byzantine Emperor Justinian, there was a significant surge in architectural, sculptural, and painting endeavors, largely dedicated to glorifying the church. Frescoes were gradually replaced by intricate mosaic paintings.
Mosaics become dominant.
Yes. Architectural adornments evolved from simple geometric patterns to more elaborate and symbolic imagery. However, a more naturalistic style of painting persisted in the Adriatic and Aegean Islands and southern Italy, influenced by mosaic art and even used to decorate palace walls.
So different styles coexisted.
It seems so. The Byzantine era also saw a remarkable flourishing of jewelry making, utilizing precious stones and intricate embroidery on textiles used for floor coverings, sacred vestments, and wall hangings.
Luxurious arts.
Very much so. Interestingly, the source notes that some early Turkish carpets from around the 1200s even had their designs embroidered. In contrast, the Islamic world at that time didn't have the same tradition of grand mosaic work for interior decoration, and early Hatti carpets had distinct characteristics with diverse ornamental borders and unique, non-repeating patterns.
It sounds like a rich period of artistic and architectural innovation, building upon earlier traditions, but also forging new paths. Now, let's go back to the initial Roman conquest. How did Rome first establish its control over these Hellenistic states in Asia Minor?
Okay, so in the 1st century BCE, through a series of military victories in Asia Minor and at Corinth, the Romans effectively gained control over the existing Hellenistic states.
Military might?
This transformed the Mediterranean into a Roman lake, and the Romans built extensive networks of roads to facilitate trade and communication across their newly acquired territories.
Mare Nostrum.
Exactly. A lengthy colonization process spanning approximately 10 generations followed this political takeover. Roman colonies were established in strategically important Mediterranean cities, and Anatolia was officially designated as Rome's Asian province.
The Asian province.
After the High Roman Empire began to weaken due to internal social class divisions, new centers of power and distinct cultural identities started to emerge around Asia Minor, leveraging the existing Roman infrastructure and influence. The social unrest caused by the widening gap between the wealthy elite and the impoverished majority allowed for the development of unique identities on the fringes of Asia Minor.
So Roman power both integrated the region and inadvertently created the conditions for new identities to form. What about the legal and administrative aspects of Roman rule in this part of the world?
Well, Roman laws, which often created monopolies, weren't always advantageous for the Greeks.
Not always convenient.
City-states were forbidden from forming leagues or alliances without explicit Roman approval, even if these cities had long-standing aristocratic traditions and held high status within the Hellenistic world.
Limiting local power.
Each Western city initially had its autonomy guaranteed by a charter granted by Rome, However, over time, centralization movements gradually eroded the independence of these Greek colonies.
Centralization creeping in.
During the Republican period of Rome, provincial administrators were selected by the Senate. But later, under the emperors, these officials became emperor-appointed governors who served one-year terms and were directly accountable for their administration.
Shift from Senate to emperor control.
Major cities, however, were able to thrive, gaining wealth, status, and legal rights by exploiting the newly acquired territories of the Eastern monarchies. Establishing Roman colonies and fortifying existing cities became important avenues for the newly wealthy to consolidate their power and influence.
Opportunities for the rich.
While the Western states experienced a form of economic exploitation through state-controlled goods and the imposition of charter rules, the pressure from these new Roman-backed power centers was more acutely felt by the eastern cities. Anatolia officially became Rome's Asian province after Antony's defeat at the Battle of Actium.
Right.
Despite the benefits that Roman rule brought to some, there were various uprisings against Roman domination in Asia, mirroring similar protests in other Western provinces.
Resistance was always there.
It seems so. And this brings us to the Byzantine Empire, which our source describes as emerging from the eastern lands of the Roman Empire during a period of Roman captivity. That's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, Roman captivity. It implies a continuation, but also a transformation.
Yes, the eastern portion of the Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, evolved into what we know as the Byzantine Empire. It became the second most influential empire after Rome itself.
Second only to Rome.
Initially, Byzantium was just a small settlement located on the Bosphorus Strait. Its strategic geographical position, controlling the crucial waterways between the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara, allowed it to gradually expand its influence, eventually turning the surrounding regions into its colonies.
Location.
It's absolutely key.
Yep.
Emperor Constantine's decision to make Byzantium the Roman Empire's capital was driven by its formidable military advantages. It was surrounded by water on three sides, its robust economic position as a major intersection of trade routes, and its favorable climate and natural beauty.
A strategic choice.
The city was extensively rebuilt and expanded, initially renamed New Rome, and later becoming universally known as Constantinople in honor of the emperor. A monumental achievement of this era was the construction of the Hagia Sophia in 537 AD.
Hagia Sophia, iconic.
With its unprecedented dome, which remained a truly awe-inspiring structure even after the Ottoman conquest, when it was converted into a mosque, and continues to inspire even today.
So Constantinople became the heart of a new and enduring empire, carrying forward many Roman and Greek traditions. What were some of the key cultural and religious transformations that occurred under the Byzantines?
Well, the Greek-influenced religious landscape gradually evolved into the Roman Catholic system. However, it's crucial to note that the Eastern Orthodox tradition also took firm root and flourished within the Byzantine Empire.
So both East and West branches developing.
Right. Greek played a vital role in the conversion to Christianity of various linguistic groups bordering the empire, including those speaking Arabian, Syriac, Ethiopian, and Coptic languages in different regions. Hellenic intellectual traditions contributed significantly to the development of Christian theology, philosophy, and rhetoric.
Greek philosophy shaping theology.
During the Byzantine period, the religion acquired a more pronounced aesthetic dimension, incorporating elements of Roman and Greek mythology into its artistic expressions. The Byzantines skillfully utilized this rich cultural heritage to enhance their religious practices through the creation of icons, illuminated manuscripts, paintings, and hymns.
A very visual, ascetic faith.
They also continued the pursuit of knowledge in areas like Greek philosophy, mathematics, literature, and history, contrasting somewhat with the more practically focused Roman emphasis on building roads, bridges, and temples.
Intellectual pursuits continued strongly.
Yes. The Byzantine Empire remarkably endured for 10 centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 395 AD,
10 centuries?
Making its history incredibly significant when considering the history of Turkey, as the empire's eastern and southern territories encompassed significant portions of what is now Asia Minor.
And how did these profound political and religious shifts impact the cultural landscape of what is now Turkey during the Roman and Byzantine periods?
Cultural developments were indeed deeply intertwined with the political events of the time. The most prominent architectural remains from this era are primarily Roman, suggesting a period of significant prosperity and grandeur.
Roman architecture dominates the ruins.
Even smaller towns boasted the construction of temples, churches, and arenas, indicating a widespread level of development. Structures such as monumental archways, roads, bridges, aqueducts, and public baths brought a sense of international identity to these urban centers.
The infrastructure of empire.
City planning was undertaken with careful consideration of geographical space, strategically arranging streets, public spaces, temples, baths, and markets, fostering not only administrative and commercial identity, but also contributing to a rich cultural life and the flourishing of art and architecture.
Planned cities.
Monumental archways, initially erected to honor victorious figures, evolved into a significant architectural tradition. The decoration of temples reflected the function and prevailing religious beliefs of the period, with a notable emphasis on the cult of fate and the construction of temples dedicated to fortune, regardless of specific religious affiliations.
Temples to fortune. Interesting.
The shift from open-air temples to enclosed structures to accommodate larger congregations led to the expansion of existing temples and the construction of new temple monuments. The emergence of domed temples and churches marked a significant architectural innovation, with temples continuing to serve as mediators of concepts like time and fate.
Domes are right.
Public games, including horse racing and gladiatorial competitions, were held before important ceremonies to engage the community and garner popular support. The arenas built for these spectacles were massive in scale,
Huge arenas.
exceeding simpler architectural designs and serving not only for leisure, but also as venues for gambling and even high-stakes political maneuvering. Open-air theaters, initially used for both worship and entertainment, grew significantly in size as congregations expanded into towns and cities, evolving from rudimentary rocky or stepped structures to monumental designs with carefully planned architectural seating.
Theaters becoming grander, too.
A period of really significant building.
It's truly remarkable to trace these successive layers of civilization and their lasting impact on the land we now know as Turkey. Now let's turn to the next major chapter, the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Our source states that this period coincided with a remarkable phase in the internal history of the Turkish people. What made it so significant?
The rise of the Ottoman Empire is indeed a pivotal moment. Following their decisive victory over the Byzantines in 1353, Sultan Fatih, also known as Mehmed the Conqueror, initiated an ambitious project.
Fatih Sultan Mehmet.
His aim was to reintegrate the diverse captured populations and transform Constantinople into a truly cosmopolitan capital. As the newly crowned Sultan of Constantinople, Fatih undertook various campaigns and offered significant financial incentives to encourage the nobility to convert to Islam.
Encouraging conversion.
He also actively promoted substantial Muslim settlement in the capital, alongside the existing Christian and Jewish communities, many of whom belonged to the urban middle class and various professions.
So it was a deliberate and multifaceted effort to reshape the city's demographics and cultural identity.
Absolutely. The Ottomans invested heavily in constructing a new cultural capital, building grand mosques, elaborate tombs, religious schools known as madrasas, and various workshops to support the city's growth and development.
Building the Ottoman capital.
They even innovated and reinvented an architectural style that could harmoniously blend Christian and Islamic architectural principles. Fatih's architectural vision began with repurposing of the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, integrating rich Islamic monumental traditions into its already awe-inspiring structure.
Reusing Hagia Sophia.
Later, under the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the brilliant architect Mimar Sinan created the Suleymaniye Mosque, an even larger and more magnificent counterpart to Hagia Sophia.
Mimar Sinan, the master architect.
This mosque and its surrounding urban complex, which included madrasas, bathhouses called hammams, a hospital, and a caravanserai, became a prime example of classical Ottoman architecture. The elegant simplicity, engaging structure, and rhythmic design of the Suleymaniye served as a major influence on later Ottoman mosques built in Istanbul, Antalya, and Edirne, often surpassing the architectural achievements of the preceding Byzantine era.
Influential design.
The relatively early construction of the Mosque of Sultan Ahmed I, famously known as the Blue Mosque for its stunning interior tilework, also established it as a significant landmark in the city.
The Blue Mosque, yes.
It sounds like the early Ottoman period was a time of immense cultural and architectural creativity. What about the administration of this rapidly expanding empire under rulers like Suleiman?
Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans ruled over a vast, multi-ethnic empire encompassing approximately 20 to 25 million people.
Huge population.
A primary challenge was the establishment of a robust governmental and administrative framework. The Ottomans focused on clearly distinguishing between temporal and spiritual authority and ensuring the gradual but effective assertion of state influence over their diverse and predominantly non-Islamic subjects.
Balancing state and religion.
The early Ottoman rulers considered various systems of governance, including hereditary succession among sons and assigning rule to the eldest member of a related dynasty residing abroad. They eventually adopted the title Pasha for governors, drawing terminology from Hungarian and Venetian administrative practices.
Using European terms like Pasha.
To govern distant provinces efficiently, they often maintained local vassal kings, some of whom were Christian, ensuring a degree of autonomy and fostering loyalty through mutually beneficial arrangements.
So the Ottoman state's governance involved a combination of direct rule in key areas and indirect control through local vassals in more distant regions.
Yeah.
When did this powerful empire actually take root and begin its remarkable expansion? Where were its origins?
The foundation of the Ottoman state was laid in the late 13th century in northwestern Anatolia, near the city of Bursa.
Near Bursa.
At that time, following the fragmentation of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, numerous small Turkish principalities, known as beyliks, emerged across Anatolia. Osman, who was the leader of one of these beyliks, proved to be the most successful and is recognized as the founder of the Ottoman dynasty.
Osman, the founder.
He skillfully built a state from the remnants of the Seljuk decline and, capitalizing on the weakening of Mongol influence in Anatolia, significantly increased his financial resources and military strength. Osman was succeeded by his son Orhan, who achieved the crucial conquest of Bursa in 1326, marking the first major Ottoman town.
Orhan takes Bursa.
Orhan's son, Murad I, further expanded Ottoman power, conquering the important Byzantine city of Adrianople in 1361, which became the second Ottoman capital, and initiating the first Ottoman military campaigns into the Balkans.
It's truly astonishing to think that from those relatively modest beginnings, the Ottomans rose to become one of the most dominant and long-lasting empires in world history.
Indeed. The Ottomans ultimately became arguably the greatest and most enduring empire in history, surpassing all that had come before them.
Quite a claim.
At its zenith, the Ottoman Empire was a hegemonic power that controlled vast territories spanning 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, and governed a diverse array of Christian and Islamic peoples for over 6 centuries. They held dominion over some of the wealthiest territories in the Islamic world and the most economically prosperous regions known at the time.
Our source mentions their origins in a somewhat remote area of the Seljuk kingdom. How did they manage to achieve such a dramatic rise from those seemingly humble beginnings?
The Ottoman Empire originated in the 1280s in northwestern Anatolia, a region that was indeed a relatively remote part of the declining Great Seljuk Sultanate. They strategically adopted the Sunni branch of Islam and skillfully expanded their power within the Byzantine Christian territories of Anatolia and the Balkans.
Expanding into Christian lands.
While their rule encompassed a wide range of diverse populations, including Shiites, and their early rulers were sometimes viewed as usurpers of power, they maintained control for hundreds of years, with surprisingly few significant rebellions, including a remarkable 3 centuries of rule in both Greece and Anatolia.
We discussed the architectural achievements of the early Ottoman period. Were the 16th and 17th centuries generally considered the peak for Ottoman art and architecture across the empire?
Yes, the 16th and 17th centuries are widely regarded as the zenith of Ottoman art and architecture. Many of the most magnificent monuments in Istanbul and other major cities throughout their vast empire were constructed during this golden age. Suleiman the Magnificent made particularly significant contributions to public architecture, commissioning numerous grand projects.
Suleiman's era.
And as we previously mentioned, architect Mimar Sinan is universally considered the greatest of all Ottoman architects, playing a central role in the design and construction of many of the empire's most iconic and impressive structures.
Tell me more about Mimar Sinan. He sounds like an exceptionally influential figure.
Sinan was truly exceptional. He arrived in the capital from the imperial provinces of Anatolia and underwent rigorous training for his profession, which was one of the most highly esteemed in the entire empire. He served as the chief architect for 3 successive sultans over a remarkable half-century.
Half a century.
Overseeing the construction of approximately 500 buildings, with over 100 still standing as testaments to his genius today. The Süleymani Mosque in Istanbul is undoubtedly one of his greatest masterpieces, comparable in scale and grandeur to the major basilicas of the world.
The Süleymaniye complex.
It features a magnificent central dome flanked by 2 smaller domes, a stone exterior clad in lead, a serene courtyard with a central fountain, a religious school, a hostel for scholars, a traditional Turkish bath, and several important mausoleums. The entire complex, known as a culi, was meticulously arranged to appear as a cohesive whole, facing a large public square that separated it from the bustling market district.
And the Sultan's mausoleum within that complex was also particularly significant and ornate, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The Sultan's mausoleum, situated within a ribbed, leaded dome courtyard close to the main prayer hall, is a stunning example of the era's artistic craftsmanship. Its exterior walls are adorned with beautifully crafted ceramic tiles and feature elegant gilt inscriptions in gold and silver, set against a striking blue background.
Gorgeous detail.
Surrounding the main tomb are a row of similarly styled, ribbed, domed mausoleums housing the remains of Suleiman's wives, sons, and daughters, commissioned by his powerful wife, Hürrem Bledi Sultan. Interestingly, even the ceremonial funeral umbrellas still used in some Ottoman-era traditions were originally designed and constructed by Sinan specifically for Suleiman's mausoleum.
It's clear that the Ottoman Empire developed a distinct and sophisticated administrative system to govern its vast territories. How did this system compare to those of other major contemporary powers like Russia and Persia?
The Ottoman Empire operated with a fundamentally different administrative approach compared to Russia and Persia. Unlike the more hierarchical structures often found in those empires, where power flowed through layers of nobility, in the Ottoman system, provincial governors, known as the beys, reported directly to the central authority in the capital.
Direct reporting to the capital.
Because the majority of significant provinces were governed in this direct manner, the sultans themselves typically did not become personally involved in the intricacies of foreign affairs or the direct command of military operations. Another key distinction was that Ottoman administration in its earlier centuries did not heavily rely on a large class of scholars, bureaucrats, or legal experts.
Less bureaucracy early on.
Yes, partly due to the Sultan's concerns about potential threats to the state's stability, as impulsive decisions made without regard to formal laws could indeed lead to chaos. As a consequence of this structure, conditions within the provinces under the authority of these governors could sometimes be quite chaotic, with arbitrary power often exercised over the common population.
So a more centralized system, perhaps, but with less emphasis on formal legal structures in its earlier stages. What about the way the Ottomans integrated the various territories of peoples they conquered into their empire?
The Ottomans generally did not replace existing states and their structures with entirely new systems centered solely in the Ottoman capital. Instead, they often retained many existing domains and their ruling families as integral parts of the empire, functioning as vassals who owed allegiance and provided resources.
Using vassals.
This approach was even applied to regions like the Mamluk provinces after they were brought under Ottoman control through warfare. As a result of this integration strategy, the Ottomans inherited a conscriptional army and, unlike Russia at the time, did not have a system of serfdom within their provincial military forces.
No serfdom like in Russia.
The central government maintained strict control over military technology and strategically reserved key roles in military outfitting for foreign officials. However, the system also had inherent weaknesses. High-ranking military commanders could accrue significant unearned income, and other powerful groups like wealthy caravan merchants, war profiteers, lords of confiscated land, and even foreign military contingents could potentially amass enough power to challenge their overlords, sometimes leading to a decline in the rural population and overall instability.
It sounds like a complex and constantly evolving system with both advantages and inherent vulnerabilities. Our source also briefly mentions the concept of gentility in Europe during this period. How does that relate to the Ottoman context?
Well, the concept of gentility in Europe initially referred to male members of newly powerful families, encompassing a broad social stratum from nobles by birth or appointment to those who held influence through their retinues or other associations. Lower levels of legal authority were often vested in this concept of gentleness, continuing as local courts with limited power, particularly when dealing with estates that held exemptions from certain tolls or had the right to prevent the forced removal of outsiders.
Okay, a European comparison.
Over time, the European gentry became increasingly independent in their dealings with both rulers and the peasantry, grew in number, and honed their administrative and managerial skills. The core of provincial government in many parts of Europe involved a council on which nearly every noble or wealthier townsman had a customary right to sit. While not a direct parallel, this European context of evolving power structures and local autonomy provides a comparative backdrop to understand the development of the Ottoman administrative system during the same historical period.
Okay, so we've seen the Ottoman Empire rise to incredible power and establish a complex system of governance. But as with all great empires, the seeds of decline were eventually sown. Our source details the weakening of the Ottoman Empire in the centuries that followed its golden age. What were the primary internal factors that contributed to this decline?
The Ottoman Empire, as we've discussed, reached a zenith of power and influence in the 15th and 16th centuries, controlling vast territories across 3 continents. However, beginning in the subsequent centuries, a combination of internal issues gradually eroded its strength.
The decline sets in.
One of the most significant challenges was the sheer difficulty of effectively managing such an immense empire, which had expanded so rapidly before the 17th century. This led to a decrease in the efficiency of tax collection.
Tax problems.
And as it became increasingly difficult to gather sufficient revenue, corruption sadly became more widespread throughout the administrative system. We also saw a significant migration of peasants away from agricultural areas towards the more central regions of Turkey, where the reach of the central state was less strong, further weakening the empire's economic foundations.
Peasants moving inwards.
Additionally, major global trade routes began to shift away from Ottoman lands towards the east, diminishing the empire's crucial role in international commerce.
And the Industrial Revolution in Europe, which we touched on earlier, must have played a significant role in this shift away from Ottoman economic dominance, didn't it?
Absolutely. The Industrial Revolution, which began in England in the late 18th century and spread across Europe, brought about profound economic transformations. The invention of steam-powered machinery revolutionized transportation, shifting from traditional methods like wagons and sailing ships to the development of railways.
Railway's a game changer.
Which required enormous amounts of capital investment. European countries, often lacking sufficient capital within their own borders, increasingly turned to the Ottoman Empire, which had accumulated significant wealth, offering financial loans, government bonds, and various forms of investment in Ottoman infrastructure and resources.
So Europe invested in the Ottoman Empire.
Yes, creating a new dynamic of economic dependence for the Ottoman Empire on European powers.
So the empire was facing internal economic problems and was becoming increasingly reliant on European capital. What about external pressures and conflicts? Our source mentions some key wars that further weakened the empire.
Yes, the Ottoman Empire suffered significant military defeats in the Balkan Wars in 1912 and then catastrophically in World War I, beginning in 1915.
World War I, the final blow.
Following the end of World War I, under the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres, the vast Ottoman Empire was essentially partitioned among the major European powers. Ottoman territories were drastically reduced, transformed into a much smaller and less powerful state, almost becoming a pawn in the geopolitical strategies of foreign interests.
The Treaty of Sèvres carving it up.
This dismantling of the old imperial order ultimately led the Turkish nation to embark on a new and arduous path through their War of Independence.
And that pivotal struggle led directly to the emergence of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and the establishment of the Turkish National Assembly.
Exactly. In 1920, the Turkish National Assembly was established in Ankara under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, who had been an Ottoman officer initially tasked with a military role in the east against Russian forces. He then galvanized a national resistance movement to oppose the invasion of the Allied powers of World War I.
Leading the resistance from Ankara.
This intense period of conflict and the fight for national sovereignty were absolutely crucial in shaping the formation of the modern Turkish state.
Our source also mentions that Turkey has experienced several economic crises in more recent times, specifically after 1990. What were some of the key characteristics and contributing factors of these later economic challenges?
Turkey has indeed faced a series of significant economic crises since 1990. Our source highlights the bank crash of November 1993, as well as 2 major foreign exchange crises in October 1994, and the particularly severe one in February 2001.
The 90s and early 2000s crises.
While both internal and external economic factors played a role in these events, the prevailing analysis suggests that internal factors, particularly issues of corruption and inefficient resource allocation, were more influential in triggering these crises.
It sounds like there were some deep-seated structural issues within the Turkish economy that made it vulnerable to these shocks.
On the eve of the last major crash in 2001, despite officially operating under an enforced open market regime, the Turkish economy still exhibited many features of a closed economy.
Still quite state-controlled then.
There was substantial government intervention in critical sectors such as utilities, the central bank, and major commercial banks, with the state holding significant ownership stakes. This high level of state involvement even while the country was attempting to liberalize its financial, trade, and investment systems starting in 1980, created a contradictory and ultimately unsustainable situation.
Trying to liberalize but still intervening heavily.
This extensive state intervention unfortunately fostered corruption by creating incentives, opportunities, and a degree of cover for illicit activities within the large state-controlled bureaucracy. The existing distribution models and the extensive degree of regulation were highly conducive to corrupt practices, further compounded by high protectionist tariffs and various market control measures.
A breeding ground for corruption.
In such an economic environment, any instance of bribery represented a hidden opportunity cost that negatively impacted the overall efficiency of the economy. Even mechanisms like reverse auctions, intended to improve transparency, often resulted in opaque administration of public finances, further contributing to the problem.
Transparency issues.
Interestingly, despite these vulnerabilities, numerous structures, rules, and procedures were indeed put in place during the 1990s that should have theoretically helped to prevent corruption, with reforms in the judicial system and a strengthening of the provincial bureaucracy. However, these measures proved insufficient to fully counteract the deeply ingrained issues.
So, a complex interplay of factors leading to recurring economic instability. Now, let's shift our focus to the rise of nationalist movements within the Ottoman Empire, a force that played a crucial role in its eventual collapse and the subsequent birth of modern Turkey.
Until the latter half of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, despite its incredibly diverse population, encompassing numerous nationalities, ethnicities, and religious groups, did not primarily define itself along these lines.
It wasn't nation-based initially.
However, as the influence of the great powers of Europe grew and nationalist aspirations began to rise within the Ottoman Empire's Western European provinces, the existing international order started to challenge the very foundations of the Ottoman state. Nationalist movements began to emerge, often fueled by the strategic interventions of these great powers.
Nationalism arrives.
The significant Ottoman losses in the Balkan Wars further intensified Turkish nationalism, leading to its broader recognition as a powerful political force. This new wave of Turkish nationalism differed from earlier forms. It became closely intertwined with ideas of cultural superiority, beyond just language, a strong emphasis on a particular historical narrative, and a more clearly defined sense of national identity.
A new kind of nationalism.
Unlike some previous Turkish nationalist thinkers who were more cautious about foreign influences, this new Turkism actively embraced, reinterpreted, and applied foreign ideologies to its own context.
It sounds like a more exclusionary and identity-focused form of nationalism was gaining momentum. How did this evolving ideology impact the policies and actions of the time?
Well, the increasing emphasis on nationality, race, language, and the nationalist motto, "Land belongs to the people who live there and pay taxes," had devastating consequences for the empire's border policies and its treatment of minority populations.
Devastating consequences.
Nationalist thinkers increasingly asserted that Asia Minor should be exclusively for Turks, with other ethnic and religious groups to be marginalized or eliminated. Forced migration was increasingly viewed as a necessary step, serving as a prelude to systematic deportations, massacres, and even what can be described as genocidal practices.
Framing forced migration as necessary.
Essentialist, racist, and reductionist constructs of self and other fundamentally reshaped the social and cultural depth of a nation, increasingly defined by narrow concepts of language and ethnicity. The establishment of linguistic borders was deemed essential for safeguarding national and state interests through the purification of Turkish territory.
And World War I served as a major catalyst in this tragic process, didn't it?
Yes, World War I marked the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's final and irreversible collapse. The decision to fully align with Germany and the Central Powers proved to be a fatal strategic error. The Entente powers responded by opening multiple fronts of conflict in the Caucasus, the Dardanelles, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean.
Fighting on multiple fronts.
Secret agreements made among the Entente powers at the outset of the war further heightened aspirations for independence among the various ethnic and religious groups within the crumbling Ottoman Empire. Beyond the immense war losses in terms of territory and human life, the intensifying ethnic tensions concerning land ownership, demographic dominance, and inheritance rights fueled growing anxieties about the very permanence of the new Turkish Republic, creating a pervasive sense of both internal and external enemies.
A sense of being besieged.
Various events and entities, ranging from the activities of the Theosophist Company in Istanbul to accusations of British and Masonic hostility, and even the use of propaganda through cartoons, were presented as evidence of these perceived threats, ultimately justifying what was framed as a national obliteration project as essential for the Turkish nation's survival and independence.
So the war and the rise of this intense nationalism fueled a period of immense upheaval and tragic violence. What was the Ottoman Empire's specific contribution to the First World War, and what were the immediate repercussions for the empire itself?
The Ottoman Empire's involvement in WWI primarily consisted of launching attacks against the British Empire in the Middle East and the Caucasus, although these military actions had limited strategic objectives. However, with the eventual collapse of the European empires following Germany's defeat, Turkey was compelled to surrender.
Surrender after German collapse.
The Ottoman perspective on the period between 1914 and 1926 is often referred to as the 15 Years' War, encompassing not only World War I itself, 1914-1918, but also the subsequent armistice of Mudros in 1918 and the Allied occupation of Istanbul in 1919.
The 15 Years' War.
Tragically, policies of ethnic cleansing and genocidal practices directed against minority populations became established state policies with a long and disturbing history, actively planned before the outbreak of WWI and becoming widespread during the conflict.
State policies of ethnic cleansing. Grim.
There was even a proposal after a hypothetical victory in WWI to reassemble all Islamic communities in the Middle East under the authority of the Caliphate in Istanbul, with the aim of preventing the rise of nationalist movements within these populations and unifying them under Sunni Islamic leadership.
A plan for a unified caliphate.
In the post-WWI territorial reforms that were envisioned, regions with a majority of Turkish speakers or under effective Turkish control were intended to be assigned to Turkey, with the expectation that the new nation would vigorously advocate for its own independence and territorial integrity. While the initial stirrings of Turkish nationalism can be traced back to the late 19th century, the first significant wave of nationalism within the Ottoman Empire manifested in the Balkans and ultimately led to various independence movements.
Balkan nationalism first.
By the early 20th century, this wave of nationalist sentiment had spread to include the Kurdish revolt, the rise of Pan-Arabism, and anti-Turkish movements among some Ottoman Greeks residing in Anatolia.
That sets the stage for the tumultuous birth of modern Turkey. Our source details the immense challenges that the newly founded republic faced immediately after its formation from the remaining Anatolian territories of the Ottoman Empire. What were some of the most critical of these early hurdles?
The newly established Republic of Turkey, emerging from the fragmented Anatolian territories of the defeated Ottoman Empire, was immediately confronted with an array of immense challenges. Securing international recognition for the new republic in the highly unstable post-World War I political landscape proved incredibly difficult.
Getting recognized was key.
With the Allied powers casting doubt on Turkish sovereignty and numerous border disputes erupting. Domestically, the fledgling state faced a population that was weary from years of war, economically impoverished, and often resistant to the radical social, economic, and political transformations being proposed.
A weary, reluctant population.
Furthermore, the Republic was far from a unified entity, comprising diverse ethnic groups who felt a sense of betrayal by the new government and by Ataturk himself.
And it wasn't just external pressures and internal resistance to this new order, was it? There also seemed to have been significant internal conflicts within the nationalist movement itself during those early years.
The period between 1920 and 1922 was indeed exceptionally turbulent, marked by a series of internal rebellions that were largely a consequence of the widespread chaos following World War I, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, and the intense power struggles that ensued.
Post-war chaos and rebellion.
A particularly notable event was the Izmir nationalist uprising known as the Offenders' Incident. This rebellion, led by former Ottoman troops who had been employed by British and Greek forces, sent shockwaves through the young Turkish government. The initial domestic policies enacted by the new government were heavily influenced by a strong desire for retribution against these Izmir rebels.
Revenge against the rebels.
Ataturk, in his unwavering determination to crush this perceived threat, even ordered the execution of many former Ottoman officers and war heroes based on a conspiracy that largely did not exist beyond a degree of sympathy for the rebel cause.
That sounds like a harsh but perhaps effective way of consolidating power. What were the broader and longer-term consequences of this suppression of internal dissent?
The violent suppression and widespread arrests that followed the Offenders' Incident ironically played a significant role in consolidating the authority of the new republic by effectively creating a common enemy against whom the populace could unite.
Uniting against a common enemy.
What had initially appeared as a serious internal political challenge was transformed into a powerful rallying point for fostering national unity. Moreover, many members of the secret society involved in the uprising were subsequently recruited into the new republic's secret police apparatus, forming a close-knit and influential oligarchy.
From rebels to secret police.
However, this period of consolidation did not lead to greater social or ethnic tolerance within the new republic. Instead, it largely accelerated the systematic suppression of non-Turkish minority groups, with Greeks and Armenians being particularly targeted.
So, amidst this internal strife and the drive for national unity, Mustafa Kemal was pushing forward with his vision for the new republic. What were his fundamental beliefs regarding Turkish independence and the structural organization of the new state?
Mustafa Kemal held a firm conviction that true and lasting Turkish independence necessitated the establishment of absolute sovereign authority over all aspects of the state's affairs.
Full sovereignty was key.
His vision for the new regime was that it should be fundamentally democratic, genuinely representative of the people's will, and ultimately governed by the people themselves through their freely elected representatives, who would be held fully accountable for their actions. He recognized that the immediate formation of a functioning parliament was the essential first step that needed to be taken before any more substantial political reforms could be effectively implemented.
And the establishment of this new parliament in Ankara represented a significant and symbolic break from the imperial Ottoman past, didn't it?
Absolutely. In October 1920, the first parliamentary elections were held under the new nationalist movement, and a new assembly convened in Ankara, marking a decisive rupture with the Ottoman era and the dawn of a new political order for Turkey.
Ankara, the new center.
In November of the same year, Ahmad İzzet Pasha, upon his selection as prime minister by this newly formed assembly, delivered an address emphasizing that it would be the assembly itself, rather than the executive cabinet or any individual minister, that would now hold the ultimate authority in directing the affairs of the state. Following this foundational step, the assembly undertook the monumental task of developing an entirely new and original constitution for the nascent republic.
Parliament holds the power.
Kemal himself wholeheartedly embraced the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, viewing the creation of a written constitution as elevating the parliament from a mere superior body to a truly sacred institution, the new Holy Writ that would serve as the fundamental basis for all future legislation.
Constitution as Holy Writ.
New parliamentary elections were held just a year later, resulting in an assembly that represented a surprisingly broad spectrum of political viewpoints, including Kemalists, socialists, nationalists, and conservatives, although the Kemalists maintained a clear hegemonic position.
Diverse assembly, but Kemalist dominance.
However, even within the dominant Kemalist movement, there were internal challenges related to traditional tribal loyalties, factionalism, and the emergence of illicit political associations. Ataturk harbored a strong desire to further amend the newly established constitution, once a greater degree of cultural and governmental stability had been achieved, with the aim of making it amendable only by the assembly itself.
Wanted to lock in parliamentary power.
While Kemal departed before these specific clauses were formally adopted, drawing some emotional and overt criticism from within the assembly, no significant public opposition to these aims emerged beyond the halls of parliament.
By 1920, it sounds like the Turkish national movement had successfully overcome a substantial amount of opposition, both domestically and internationally. Mustafa Kemal is clearly portrayed as the central driving force behind this remarkable achievement.
Indeed. By 1920, Mustafa Kemal is widely credited with having overcome much of the significant domestic and foreign opposition to the Turkish national movement. Earlier that same year, on March 16th, the victorious Allied powers of World War I had formally established their direct rule over Ottoman Istanbul, the centuries-old seat of imperial power.
Allies controlling Istanbul.
However, the Turkish national movement's resistance to this foreign occupation had already taken deep root in Anatolia, a region that had remained largely untouched by Allied troops. Shortly thereafter, on April 23rd, representatives from across Anatolia under the leadership of Kemal secretly convened in Ankara and formed the Grand National Assembly, GNA.
The GNA in Ankara.
Effectively establishing an alternative parliament to the one still operating under Allied control in Istanbul. The period that followed saw a rapid and almost weekly succession of dramatic events that seemed to consistently favor this new institution in Ankara. On May 15th, foreign troops landed in Greece and occupied the strategically important city of Izmir, a move that many considered indefensible.
Izmir occupation.
In direct response to these events, Kemal and his compatriots orchestrated a decisive coup on June 10th, which ultimately led to the exile of the last Ottoman Sultan. Kemal's resolute efforts in opposing the foreign occupation garnered him increasing respect and reverence among those living under foreign rule throughout Anatolia.
Kemal's prestige growing.
While his successful leadership in repelling the Allied forces is widely known, his equally strong determination to reestablish a centralized state with authority reminiscent of the old empire is perhaps less commonly emphasized. Ironically, this ambition for a strong, centralist state arguably became more deeply embedded in the nation's collective consciousness than even the memory of successfully repelling the foreign invaders.
And to further solidify his position and garner broader support, Kemal also actively sought the backing of religious authorities within the newly formed assembly, didn't he?
Recognizing the crucial need for religious legitimacy to bolster his propaganda efforts and mobilize popular support, Kemal skillfully secured a significant fatwa, a religious decree, from influential religious figures within the assembly.
Using a fatwa for support.
This fatwa proclaimed jihad, holy war, as the sacred duty of all true believers against the foreign occupiers, effectively mobilizing the Islamic population in support of the nationalist cause and leading to the formal appointment of a new patriarch. However, after an initial and somewhat overconfident offensive launched from Kars, and Ardahan was easily repelled by opposing forces, Kemal wisely shifted his primary focus from direct military command on the front lines to the more strategically vital task of consolidating political power in Anatolia's new capital, Ankara.
Shifting focus to Ankara.
There was even a symbolic, though perhaps more provocative than practically effective, bombing of Istanbul, which had by this point been freed from direct foreign military occupation, intended to further dismantle the remaining vestiges of the old empire, and a rather audacious ultimatum delivered to the British. In 1922, Kemal took the decisive step of formally dismissing the Sultanate altogether.
Abolishing the Sultanate.
Carefully framing this radical move, not as a regional or externally imposed issue, but as a necessary internal reform for the future of the Turkish nation. By October 22nd of that year, the rebirth of the modern Republic of Turkey as a political reality was essentially a fait accompli, with the Grand National Assembly unanimously accepting Kemal's sweeping proposals for the establishment of the new state.
Republic becomes reality.
Interestingly, it took approximately a week for any significant dissent regarding these fundamental changes to surface within the assembly, with subsequent reconsiderations raising only minimal and largely isolated concerns, primarily regarding the precise definition of the new national border. Elections were held just days later, with Kemal being overwhelmingly elected as the first president of the new republic.
So, the birth of modern Turkey was a complex and at times violent process, shaped by internal power struggles, external pressures, and the force of a strong nationalist vision. Our source also highlights the emergence of new national identities in the 19th century and how that played a significant role in both the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the eventual formation of the Republic.
The 1800s witnessed the rise of new national identities across Europe, often based on shared language and ethnicity, and the Ottoman Empire, with its diverse tapestry of nationalities, ethnicities, and religions, was profoundly affected by these transformative ideas.
Nationalism impacting the Ottomans.
While there were attempts within the empire to cultivate a common Ottoman identity rooted in Islam, hoping to prioritize state unity over its inherent diversity, these efforts ultimately proved insufficient to stem the tide of rising nationalism among its various subject peoples. Early attempts at centralization under Sultan Mahmud II in the early 1800s, partly in response to the Tanzimat reform movement, were met with fierce resistance from the powerful Janissary Corps, ironically leading to the army becoming the primary secular institution within the empire.
And the empire's gradual loss of its Balkan territories further fueled these burgeoning nationalist sentiments, didn't it?
The European powers' gradual retreat from the Balkans, coupled with attempts by the Ottoman government to make concessions to its increasingly restive minority populations, inadvertently sparked further revolts, culminating in the pivotal Young Turk Revolution of 1908.
The Young Turk Revolution.
The widely perceived plight of Balkan Christians under Ottoman rule and the emergence of new national movements in the wake of European withdrawal galvanized Turkish nationalists. They increasingly viewed the situation as their last chance to prevent the complete disintegration of the empire in the face of relentless European imperialism. Ethnicity increasingly supplanted religion as the dominant political ideology, with Istanbul serving as the central hub for these nationalist movements.
Ethnicity over religion.
The powerful slogan, "Turkey for Turks," gained significant traction, advocating for the expulsion of Greeks and Armenians, who were increasingly viewed as inherently inferior and incapable of truly embracing Turkish civilization. The Committee of Union and Progress, the driving force behind the Young Turk movement, embraced a radical form of nationalism, explicitly modeled after German anti-Slavic nationalism.
Radical nationalism, Turkey for Turks.
Tragically, during World War I, the alignment of the Ottoman Empire with Germany and the perceived alignment of some Armenian groups with Russia led to the horrific Armenian genocide.
And in the aftermath of the war, the newly formed Kemalist Republic's primary focus shifted towards gaining crucial international recognition for its existence and sovereignty. How did the treaties that followed World War I ultimately impact the new nation and its aspirations?
Securing international recognition was of paramount importance for the nascent Kemalist Republic. The signing of the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 was a devastating blow to Turkish nationalist aspirations.
Sèvres was harsh.
Effectively reducing the remnants of the once mighty empire to Anatolia and a small portion of Thrace, imposing severe restrictions on the Turkish military, establishing international financial oversight, and even proposing the creation of autonomous minority states within its borders. Greece, however, vehemently rejected the treaty and launched an invasion of Anatolia, only to be eventually driven back by the determined forces of the Turkish nationalist movement.
Greece rejected Sèvres too.
Ultimately, the Allied powers' attempts to fully enforce the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres met with fierce and sustained Kemalist resistance, leading to the negotiation and signing of the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. This new treaty, while recognizing Turkish sovereignty over its core territories, did necessitate the curtailment of some of the more expansive territorial and nationalist aims that had been envisioned by certain factions within the movement.
So the 20th century brought immense upheaval and fundamental transformation for Turkey. Let's delve a little deeper into the initial years of that century. Our source revisits the Young Turks in World War I. What were the immediate consequences of their rise to power in 1908?
In 1908, as we discussed, the Young Turks successfully pressured Sultan Abdülhamid II to reinstate the constitution, raising hopes for a more modern and representative government. However, this initial optimism was quickly overshadowed by the growing international tensions that would soon erupt into World War I.
Hope followed by WWI.
The Ottoman Empire's fateful decision to align itself with Germany and the Central Powers proved to be a critical and ultimately devastating strategic error. Following significant Allied victories, including the British colonial troops' success at Gallipoli in 1915, the tide of the war began to turn decisively against the Ottomans.
Gallipoli turning point.
They were eventually expelled from much of the Arab world, and Istanbul itself came under the control of Allied occupation forces. British forces gained control of strategically important territories like Jerusalem and Baghdad, while the French moved into Lebanon and Syria, effectively dismantling large swaths of the former Ottoman Empire. Adding to this precarious situation, Greek forces also invaded Ottoman territory, landing in Izmir in mid-1919, further threatening the empire's territorial integrity.
It sounds like the Ottoman Empire was teetering on the brink of complete disintegration. What role did the last Sultan Mehmed VI play in these final tumultuous years of the empire?
Amidst this rapidly accelerating disintegration of the empire, the last Sultan, Mehmed VI, seemed to believe that his best course of action was to attempt to safeguard his own position by essentially surrendering what remained of the Ottoman Empire to the victorious foreign invaders.
Surrendering to the invaders.
To this end, an allied army composed of Greek, Italian, and French forces was permitted to move into Anatolia to begin the process of occupation.
But the spirit of resistance wasn't entirely extinguished, was it? Our source highlights the emergence of a significant resistance movement within unoccupied Anatolia.
Absolutely. In the regions of Anatolia that remained free from direct Allied occupation, a powerful and increasingly widespread resistance movement began to take shape, particularly in the Aegean provinces that were the immediate targets of the Greek invasion.
Resistance in Anatolia.
The government in Istanbul, in a move that they would soon come to deeply regret, dispatched a capable Ottoman general named Mustafa Kemal to Anatolia, ostensibly with the mission of suppressing this burgeoning rebellion. However, upon his arrival and quickly recognizing the widespread popular support for resistance, Kemal instead chose to align himself with the movement and, with significant material and moral backing from the Anatolian peasantry, began to effectively lead the resistance efforts.
Kemal switches sides, leads resistance.
Over the next few years, this nascent movement rapidly grew into a substantial national army, which ultimately succeeded in driving out the foreign occupying forces. Nearly all of Anatolia was liberated through a series of hard-fought battles, culminating in a decisive and complete defeat inflicted by Kemal's forces upon the Greek army in western Anatolia on August 30th, 1922.
And this remarkable military victory directly paved the way for the formal establishment of the Republic of Turkey.
Precisely. Under the visionary leadership of Mustafa Kemal, the remaining territories of the once mighty Ottoman Empire were officially transformed into the Republic of Turkey in October 1923.
Republic declared, 1923.
In a symbolic move signifying a break with the imperial past, the capital city was moved from the historic Istanbul to the more centrally located Ankara. Turkey emerged as one of the world's first explicitly secular states, marking the beginning of what is widely regarded as the Turkish Renaissance, a period of intense social, political, and cultural transformation.
Secular state, Turkish Renaissance.
However, as Kemal himself astutely observed, this newly forged Turkish identity faced continuous challenges and threats from both external and internal adversaries. He famously described this transformative period as a process of Herculean effort, of vast political and social reforms, began to melt an ancient and hoary Orient into a modern and youthful West.
The 20th century, as we know, was defined by another major global conflict, World War II. What was Turkey's official stance and experience during that tumultuous period?
As World War II engulfed the globe, Turkey, under the leadership of İsmet İnönü, skillfully navigated the complex geopolitical landscape and successfully maintained a policy of neutrality, avoiding direct entry into the war.
Staying neutral in WWII.
This was a precarious balancing act, especially considering the ominous rise of fascism in Europe and Hitler's aggressive expansionist policies. The Munich Conference, following Germany's annexation of the Sudetenland and the subsequent establishment of a protectorate over Bohemia and Moravia, initially led some politicians, like Chamberlain, to believe that German expansionism could be appeased and contained.
Appeasement hopes dashed.
However, the sudden and brutal attack on Poland in September 1939 quickly shattered this illusion, prompting Britain and France to declare war on Germany and igniting a global conflict. Turkey found itself in a particularly vulnerable geographical position, facing the potential for war on its southeastern front, with Italy, allied with Germany, openly seeking to expand its territorial control in the Mediterranean region.
Vulnerable position.
Simultaneously, Japan's aggressive expansion in the Pacific was deeply alarming to the United States, ultimately culminating in the attack on Pearl Harbor.
It sounds like Turkey was in a very strategically sensitive and potentially dangerous position during the Second World War.
Yeah.
How did they manage to maintain their neutrality for so long in such a volatile environment?
Turkey managed to navigate this exceptionally dangerous environment with a remarkable degree of independence and diplomatic skill under İnönü's leadership, drawing valuable lessons from the devastating experience of World War I.
Learning from WWI.
They engaged actively in diplomatic relations with Britain and France, while simultaneously maintaining a cautious neutrality in their dealings with the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, who were actively attempting to exert influence in the Balkans or even directly pressure Turkey. Turkey fundamentally reformulated its foreign policy based on the hard-won experiences of the First World War.
Balancing act diplomacy.
The well-coordinated diplomatic initiatives undertaken by the ruling Democratic Party also succeeded in garnering significant sympathy from the United States, particularly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, which led to increased U.S. collaboration with Britain and its allies. Through a combination of skillful diplomatic maneuvering, a careful consideration of complex domestic and international conditions, and a determination to avoid direct involvement, Turkey ultimately managed to remain neutral until the very final moments of the war.
And the end of World War II didn't necessarily usher in an era of peace and stability for Turkey, did it?
Oh.
The Cold War was just beginning, presenting a new set of geopolitical challenges.
That's absolutely correct. Turkey faced immediate and significant geopolitical challenges as the Cold War began to take shape. The United States adopted a firm policy of containing Soviet expansionist pressure on Turkey.
U.S. containment policy.
And the Soviet Union's territorial demands against Turkey became one of the very first major crises of the emerging Cold War. In 1947, U.S. Secretary of State Acheson famously pledged an umbrella of American responsibility over the strategically vital Dardanelles Strait and the territorial integrity of Turkey.
The U.S. umbrella.
The Truman Doctrine, which was officially launched to implement the containment strategy against Soviet expansionism, marked the formal beginning of the crucial Turkey-U.S. alliance and Turkey's integration into the Western defense system. As part of this alliance, Turkey received substantial U.S. military aid to enhance its defense capabilities and develop military bases, particularly airfields, in exchange for granting the U.S. access to these bases for intelligence gathering and monitoring of the Soviet Union.
Truman Doctrine, U.S. aid bases.
In addition to military assistance, Turkey also received long-term economic aid, similar in concept to the Marshall Plan, as it was firmly accepted as a key member of the Western Alliance. Furthermore, Turkey was offered the significant security guarantee of a defense umbrella under the newly formed North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, extending the principle of collective defense under Article 5 of the Washington Treaty.
Marshall Plan type aid, NATO membership.
The Truman Doctrine thus marked the definitive beginning of Turkey's unwavering commitment to the Western alliance system and the development of a robust framework of mutual U.S.-Turkish defense cooperation.
And Turkey actively demonstrated this commitment throughout the Cold War, didn't it? Solidifying its role as a key strategic partner in the region.
Indeed. Turkey actively demonstrated its commitment to the Western alliance in numerous ways. Notably, it deployed troops to participate in the Korean War in 1950, bravely supporting the U.S.-led United Nations operation against the North Korean invasion.
Troops to Korea.
With the full approval of the United States, Turkey also made its strategically important NATO bases available to Western countries for crucial logistical support operations. The mid-1950s are often considered a high point, a golden age, in U.S.-Turkish relations within the context of the Cold War.
Mid-50s golden age.
However, this positive environment experienced some strain due to the escalating Cyprus issue and the 1960 coup d'etat led by the Kemalist National Unity Committee within Turkey.
Cyprus issue. 1960 coup causing strain.
While these developments did introduce complexities into the U.S.-Turkish relationship, the fundamental principles of mutual assurance and strategic cooperation were largely maintained. Turkey also played a significant, though perhaps less widely known role during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962.
Cuban Missile Crisis role.
Accepting the deployment of Jupiter ballistic missiles on its territory as part of a strategic exchange that led to the Soviet Union's agreement to remove its missiles from Cuba, with Turkish leaders being fully informed of the details of this delicate arrangement. While the alliance experienced occasional periods of tension and disagreement related to events like the Turkish intervention in northern Cyprus and other geopolitical developments, the underlying framework of U.S.-Turkish mutual assurance generally functioned effectively throughout the Cold War.
Now, looking at Turkey's economic trajectory once again, our source indicates a recurring pattern of economic booms followed by crises since the early 1980s. What are the defining characteristics of this volatile period?
Since the early 1980s, Turkey has indeed experienced a cyclical pattern of significant economic growth punctuated by recurring crises. The Turkish economy demonstrated considerably stronger performance between 1980 and 1990 compared to the preceding decade, achieving an average annual growth rate exceeding 5%.
80s growth.
This period of recovery and expansion was accompanied by significant economic reforms, including a shift in export policy, a decline in the prominence of import substitution industries, and the emergence of a more dynamic and outward-oriented economic sector.
Reforms, more export-focused.
The 1990s continued this trend of increasing outward economic engagement, but were unfortunately marred by instability within the banking and financial sectors, a rise in inflation, largely used to finance public sector deficits, and a deterioration of the overall fiscal balance.
90s instability, inflation.
The implementation of necessary economic adjustments was hampered by a number of factors, including a lack of strong credibility in monetary policy institutions, the persistent weakness of state-owned enterprises and banks, and the undue influence of established economic and political elites. Consequently, the fundamental reforms needed to ensure long-term economic sustainability were often implemented too late, or in a piecemeal fashion, contributing to the recurring cycle of crises.
Reforms too late. Elite capture.
The substantial captive savings accumulated under the previous economic regime were often inefficiently allocated towards short-term growth initiatives and were further mismanaged by new authorities operating under pressure from international institutions like the IMF. The political stalemate that followed the 1999 elections further complicated the situation,
Political stalemate hindering things.
leading to mismanagement of the crucial disinflation program and a failure to adequately protect and strengthen economic assets through the consistent application of the rule of law, robust institutional improvements, and the fostering of genuinely competitive markets. This ultimately led to Turkey experiencing increasing economic imbalances, periods of rapid and unsustainable growth, downward economic spirals, and a significant snowball effect in asset prices.
So a period of significant economic volatility and challenges that continued into the contemporary era. Now let's turn our attention to contemporary Turkey as it navigates the complexities of the 21st century. Our source provides some insights into its role in the Middle East and its evolving foreign policy in recent decades.
After Turkey maintained a position of military neutrality during the 1991 Gulf War, the United States offered assurances of continued aid within the framework of a new partnership and provided financial assistance specifically earmarked for the resettlement of Serbian and Croatian refugees displaced from northern Bosnia.
Post-Gulf War U.S. aid.
However, Turkey notably dismissed the potential long-term risks associated with the violent disintegration of Yugoslavia, attributing the primary problems to nationalism, rather than viewing it as a broader conflict against international norms and civilization. Turkey's primary regional concern in the immediate post-Cold War period remained its neighboring countries, a concern that was heightened after the Gulf War by the increased influx of Kurdish refugees from Iraq, a development that was largely met with disapproval by the Turkish establishment.
Concerned about neighbors, Kurdish influx.
The response to the Gulf War within Turkey, particularly by the PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party, was generally not embraced by the broader Turkish population and was largely seen as an isolated and unpopular act. Interestingly, Turkey did not express significant concern regarding the Peshmerga's opening of a new front in northern Iraq.
PKK response seen as isolated.
While Turkey had historically accused Syria of supporting the PKK's earlier activities in the post-ethnic cleansing context of Atatürk's Turkey, there was a growing unease regarding the rise of Islamic regimes in neighboring Iran and Iraq. Some Turkish strategists viewed this as a new front in a broader Eurasian power equilibrium involving Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the potential for democratic transitions in Egypt.
Unease about Iran-Iraq, Eurasian balance ideas.
In the final post-Cold War decade of the 20th century, Turkish exports experienced a significant collapse, amounting to a decrease of $35 billion according to the Meta model, despite the implementation of freer trade policies and floating exchange rates. This economic downturn significantly impacted finance capital,
Late 90s export collapse.
leading to a period of unsustainable, short-term focused financial entrepreneurship and triggering a wave of bank-dominated crises that affected a majority of the country's provinces. However, a new economic chief, appointed in mid-2001, succeeded in taking decisive action to curb the power of entrenched financial interests by closing down poorly managed state-owned banks and challenging the financial hegemony that had previously questioned the country's oil policies.
2001 reforms tackling banks.
Preceding the ensuing political crisis, a decade of stagnant, low economic growth had interrupted the short-term focus of finance capital. Ironically, the attendant peace process aimed at resolving internal conflicts in the South and West was hastily deemed a failure by many, and anti-socialist and secularist Islamic-leaning parties gained significant ground in primary elections.
Turkey's relationship with its surrounding region has clearly been complex and has undergone significant shifts in recent times. What about its relations with specific countries in the Middle East, such as Israel?
Turkish-Israeli relations experienced a notable upswing in the early 2000s, reaching what some observers describe as a potential golden age, with diplomatic ties raised to the level of ambassadorial exchange for the first time.
Early 2000s thaw with Israel.
However, Turkey's broader foreign policy in the Middle East has been characterized by periods of both tension and cooperation over the decades, navigating a delicate balance in its interactions with powerful Arab monarchies and republics. The last few decades have indeed ushered in what many scholars consider a new era in Turkish diplomacy, marked by increasing maturity and Turkey's emergence as a significant regional power.
Emerging regional power status.
The rise of the AKP, Justice and Development Party, led to a concerted effort to adjust Turkey's relations with Muslim-majority nations across the political spectrum, with a particular focus on turbulent but strategically vital regions. The normalization of relations with Syria, a country with whom Turkey had a historically complex and often adversarial relationship, was a particularly noteworthy achievement, complemented by a deepening of ties with neighboring Iran.
AKP era, reaching out to Muslim nations, Syria normalization.
Despite past disputes and conflicts, Turkey and Syria had experienced a surprising period of détente in the decade leading up to the Arab Spring uprisings.
And the Arab Spring proved to be another major turning point, significantly impacting Turkey's regional relationships and forcing new strategic decisions, didn't it?
The Arab Spring undeniably marked a significant watershed moment in Turkey's regional relations, forcing both Turkey and its neighbor Cyprus to confront and make critical new geopolitical decisions. Given that Turkey's southern border with Syria had been formally settled since the 1950s, the eruption of the Syrian civil war could not leave Turkey indifferent.
Couldn't ignore Syria.
Ankara initially attempted to play a key role as a mediator in the conflict, engaging with both the Assad regime and its primary opponent, the Muslim Brotherhood. However, this involvement deepened over time, with Turkey ultimately siding with a particular militant Islamic faction in the internal Syrian conflict, a decision that many analysts now view as a significant setback for Turkish foreign policy and its regional standing.
Siding with militants seen as a setback.
Turkey's covert involvement in transporting weapons from Libya to anti-Assad groups and its support for a specific militant group in Syria led to a painful reassessment of its previously active diplomatic approach in the Middle East, effectively marking the abandonment of the long-held zero problems with neighbors policy that had dominated Turkish foreign policy in the region for many years.
Abandoning zero problems.
Furthermore, the internal upheaval within Turkey following the failed coup attempt of 2016 also ushered in a new and complex phase in its relations with neighboring states concerning ethno-national and religious diasporas.
Moving on to Turkey's incredibly rich cultural heritage, our source emphasizes its long and continuous history of settlement and the sheer abundance of its archaeological and historical sites.
Having been continuously inhabited from the Neolithic period through the Republic era, Turkey is indeed exceptionally rich in material culture, boasting a vast number of significant archaeological and historical sites that tell the story of millennia of human civilization.
Millennia of history.
The Constitution of the Republic of Turkey explicitly states that all cultural heritage located within its borders is the cultural inheritance of the Turkish nation as a whole. During the Republic period, two fundamental approaches shaped the development of legal and administrative institutions responsible for managing this heritage: nationalization and publicization.
Nationalization and publicization of heritage.
Prior to this period, property law had largely reverted to the authority of local government, and even the civil code itself was based on a direct translation of the Swiss Responsibility Act. Provincial municipalities held the authority to designate residential, religious, historical, and archaeological sites for official preservation.
Local control. Swiss code influence.
Interestingly, our source mentions a historical pledge involving the hand of the Byzantine king being offered to the French crown, which resulted in the French seizure of significant wealth from the Byzantine Empire. Turkey also took an early and notable international initiative concerning its cultural heritage with the Bogazkoy commercial tablets in 1898.
Bogazkoy Tablets Initiative.
The Young Turk movement sought to claim areas containing Armenian cities and archaeological sites, declaring them public lands first of the Ottoman Empire and then of Turkey. However, imperial states did not include these specific claims in the subsequent treaties, although various contracts were indeed signed. The pre-Republican bibliography on these subjects is of great importance to the history of science and constitutes the fundamental scaffolding upon which Turkish archaeology is built.
Pre-Republic sources vital for archaeology.
The Republic adopted a comprehensive and centralized approach across economic, educational, political, cultural, and informational domains, establishing a central political authority with linked centers of rights and responsibilities, including institutions like the central bank, various departments, religions, information, tourism, public enterprises, and embassies abroad.
Centralized Republic approach.
However, initiatives to establish private museums, news agencies, publishing houses, and cinemas during the Republic period often lacked sufficient freedom and autonomy from state control. Newspaper advertisements from the time, such as one promoting the Egyptian Museum as a world-class museum, offer valuable insights into early Republican-era perspectives on archaeology and the role of museums. The overarching priority during this period was to implement gradual and interconnected steps towards the publicization and nationalization of Turkey's extensive cultural heritage.
Turkey's unique geographical position, serving as a bridge between Europe and Asia, has clearly been a major factor in shaping its incredibly diverse cultural landscape, as evidenced by its numerous and varied ancient sites.
And indeed, Turkey's strategic location has fostered a rich and multifaceted cultural heritage, spanning over 10,000 years of continuous human activity. Early cultural markers include fascinating prehistoric rock carvings, enigmatic clay figurines, impressive megalithic structures, the incredibly ancient settlement of Seljuk.
Atatürk, amazing site.
Kultepe, with its invaluable written tablets, the former Hittite capital of Hattusa, the striking Lycian rock tombs, grand temples dedicated to Artemis, and the magnificent Hellenistic and Roman monuments of Ephesus, Pergamon, and Aphrodisias. The Byzantine Empire added its own distinctive architectural contributions, including the awe-inspiring basilicas of Istanbul and the domed mosques that dot the region.
So many layers.
Following the arrival of the Turks, monumental art continued to flourish, with early examples being the Seljuk mosques of central Anatolia and the large, imposing domed Ottoman mosques that were constructed along the Anatolian coasts in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Turkish art also continued to be significantly influenced by the delicate beauty of Persian miniatures and the intricate patterns of carpets.
Seljuk, Ottoman, Persian influence is continuing.
However, modern painting was adopted later in Turkey compared to other Western art forms, with this gap largely being addressed in the early Republic period, 1923-1938, through the establishment of key educational institutions like the Fine Arts Academy.
And Turkey's contributions to the world of literature and the broader arts are also incredibly significant and continue to resonate, aren't they?
In the realm of literature, the works of major Turkish poets from centuries past continue to be widely read, studied, and deeply admired. A significant and growing number of novels have been published, with authors exploring a diverse range of themes and perspectives, extending far beyond the traditional cultural center of Istanbul.
Rich literary tradition.
Other branches of literature, including history, literary criticism, dramatic plays, and insightful essays, have also produced numerous notable figures and influential works. Interestingly, the academic study of Homeric epics became a new and significant area of literary focus in Turkey following the takeover of the Levant region, generating increased readership and lively debate, as seen in literary journals, particularly around the nuances of Adnan Apexi's metrical translations.
Homeric studies gaining ground.
Contemporary fiction also began to grapple with the new and pressing social problems of the time, for example, in the novels of Noyen and Nadir. There was also a noticeable increase in the number of historians who openly identified with Muslim perspectives in their historical analyses, such as Nizami and Rifik. Classic narratives like The Thousand and One Nights were also reimagined and retold in various forms by Turkish writers, for example, by Miathat and Zia.
Adapting classics, too.
However, the development of a robust academic style and rigorous argumentation in scholarly works initially faced some challenges. Early historians, such as Tivik, often pursued their research at a more leisurely pace, while a spirit of intellectual ferment and sometimes critical restivity prevailed in academic journals. The limited study of European languages before the establishment of certain educational reforms, like Cambria, and the incomplete translation of counterarguments from international scholarship also posed initial obstacles to the rapid development of academic discourse.
And of course, we absolutely cannot overlook Turkish cuisine, which enjoys a global reputation for its richness, variety, and exquisite flavors.
Turkish cuisine is indeed one of the world's oldest and most distinctive culinary traditions, tracing its origins back to the pre-agricultural diet of the nomadic Turkic peoples, which primarily consisted of meat, milk, and various dairy byproducts.
Nomadic roots.
Today, modern Turkish cuisine stands as an independent and highly evolved culinary art form, clearly distinguishable from Arab, Persian, and Greek influences, having developed through the absorption and integration of diverse culinary traditions from the various nations and regions that became part of its historical empires, with Istanbul as its vibrant gastronomic heart.
A unique blend.
Culinary skills in Turkey are remarkably refined and incredibly varied, with foods and drinks often presented with great artistic flair and attention to detail. Turkey's long and complex history as the birthplace and center of numerous significant civilizations and states is clearly reflected in its rich and layered cooking traditions.
History reflected in the food.
Turkic tribes who migrated to Anatolia placed a high value on food and beverage preparation techniques, and the later urban cultures that flourished in Anatolian cities contributed significantly to the refinement of dishes featuring meat, milk, cereals, vegetables, and a wide array of aromatic herbs. Traditional villages across Turkey, beyond the cosmopolitan culinary scene of Istanbul, also developed their own diverse and distinctive food and beverage specialties, reflecting the unique agricultural resources and cultural influences of their regions. For example, in Sinop, Çorum, Kanakkale, Adana, Muğla, and the Black Sea region.
Regional diversity is key.
While many aspects of modern food production have become globally standardized, Turkish cuisine has retained its distinctiveness through its remarkable versatility and the sheer variety of its dishes. A vast array of diverse Turkish foods and drinks from different regions, from East Turkestan to the Balkans, illustrates this incredible culinary abundance. While it's increasingly difficult to define a purely thematic cooking culture in today's interconnected world, with dishes from Asia, the Balkans, the Caucasus, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean all falling within a shared scope of historical interaction and mutual culinary influence, it's important to recognize this interconnectedness rather than making unsubstantiated claims of absolute superiority for any single food tradition.
Finally, our source provides a glimpse into Turkey's vibrant and enduring tradition of festivals and celebrations, which offer a window into its rich cultural tapestry.
Turkey's deeply rooted cultural heritage is vibrantly expressed through its rich folklore, which manifests in a wide spectrum of traditional ceremonies, lively festivals, captivating dances, and evocative music.
Folklore and festivals.
Throughout the year, both national and local celebrations and observances are numerous, often featuring compelling dramatic performances, traditional music, folk dances, rich folklore, literary expressions, and a delightful array of culinary specialties prepared with locally sourced herbs and spices. While Turkey may not have one single, officially designated nationwide festival, the ancient Turkish Nowruz festival has been celebrated for over 3,000 years, coinciding with the spring equinox.
Nowruz, the spring festival.
This significant event marks the arrival of spring and also serves as the Zoroastrian New Year, New Day in Persian, holding important cultural gathering aspects for communities with nomadic backgrounds such as Kurds, Azeris, and Turks, and often carrying both social and political significance. While its public celebration was somewhat suppressed during the early Republican era, Nowruz has since experienced a revival, often celebrated through traditional folk dances, the singing of ballads, and the telling of ancient stories amidst ongoing societal changes.
Nowruz revival.
Various spontaneous and more localized festivities also occur, such as summer fairs and harvest celebrations, joyfully marking natural events like significant rainfall, the blooming of flowers, the arrival of warmth, and even the first snowfall. Numerous lesser-known local festivals in smaller villages and towns honor important religious and cultural figures, often celebrated with great enthusiasm by the local communities.
Lots of local celebrations, too.
The widely celebrated Sugar Feast marks the joyous end of the holy month of Ramadan, and another major religious festival commemorates the story of Isaac's near sacrifice at the end of the Muslim sacrificial holiday, featuring communal animal sacrifices and large celebratory feasts, often referred to as the Feast with the Meat on the first day, involving large community gatherings.
Major religious feasts.
These reward festivals contrast with more informal festivities of thankfulness, such as early traditions like chopping the wood or planting the tree to mark important milestones. In the western regions of the country, one finds more organized and increasingly commercialized festivities and fairs, some of which have historical ties to Christian or Jewish cultural traditions. Finally, village and city anniversaries represent another distinctive type of festival, often featuring various cultural activities and attended by high-ranking state officials.
Turkey's story is truly a sweeping and epic narrative, stretching across millennia and serving as a crucial bridge between continents. To bring our deep dive to a close, can you provide us with a final summary of the most significant takeaways from our exploration?
Turkey occupies a pivotal position at the crossroads of Asia and Europe, sharing borders with numerous countries and boasting a cultural heritage and history that continues to exert a profound and enduring influence on the world stage.
Crossroads of continents.
Over the course of its long history, This land has experienced remarkable periods of power, cultural flourishing, and significant development, as well as periods of decline and dramatic redesign, particularly in the aftermath of the World Wars. Ruled by a succession of influential civilizations, from the ancient Hittites and Phrygians to the Romans, Byzantines, and finally the Ottomans, the Anatolian Peninsula has been a strategically vital and often contested territory.
Layer upon layer of empires.
The Ottoman Empire eventually rose to become the dominant power in the region, but its centuries-long reign was followed by a period of gradual decline and ultimately the loss of sovereignty after the First World War. The formation of the new Turkish nation under the leadership of Ataturk brought about a unique social structure and a determined drive towards modernization and secularization.
Ottomans' rise and fall, Ataturk's republic.
Turkey is also blessed with remarkable natural beauty, which complements the rich tapestry of cultural heritage preserved by its ancient and medieval inhabitants. From the legendary ruins of Troy to the majestic mausoleums, the iconic Galata and Rumeli towers of Istanbul, and the architectural marvel of Hagia Sophia. While Turkey continues to aspire towards potential accession to the European Union and has experienced periods of economic prosperity, it also continues to grapple with persistent internal challenges,
Modern aspirations and challenges.
such as sectarian and religious tensions and ongoing threats to its secular traditions, all of which can impact the stability of its complex social structure.
It really does leave you with a lot to consider, doesn't it? With all of these incredible historical forces at play, which of them will ultimately prove to be the most significant in shaping Turkey's future trajectory in the 21st century? And how will Turkey's unique geographical and cultural position continue to influence the ever-evolving landscape of global events? Definitely some thought-provoking questions to take away. Thank you so much for guiding us through this fascinating deep dive.